long been an issue for me on a number of levels because I represent the Port of Los Angeles, and along with Long Beach, it's the largest port complex in this country. And one of the moves that I worked on very hard was the idea of moving cargo off-peak. And we do have a system at Long Beach and Los Angeles where we are, I think at this point, close to 50% of the cargo we're moving in the weekends and in the evenings. We were on a 21st century freight panel in this committee, and one of the recommendations that came from the panel was that ports across the country implement moving cargo in the evenings and the weekends, mainly because it allows our truck drivers to not have to compete with the commuters during rush hour on Monday through Friday. So I think it makes sense. I'd like to see that really as a policy nationwide. I think it makes a lot of sense. You know, one of the issues that has come to my attention in my port area is the classification of independent contractor for some of the port truck drivers. And I was with them this Monday. They were striking because they felt like there was wage theft and unfair employment practices by categorizing them as independent contractors as opposed to employees of the company. And many of these drivers are stuck at the bottom of the economic ladder, while other industry workers around our ports, railroads, longshoremen, are making a good living. These drivers, you know, told me that they're overworked and underpaid, which I think leads to unsafe roads because of the welfare of the driver. So, Mr. Byrd, for you, some of these port truck drivers have seen victories in courts, and yet still I think this unfair practice exists, again, particularly from my experience around the ports. Is there a Federal role in fixing this injustice, and what would that be?
Thank you for the question. I think it's a very tough and very challenging issue that you raise. With respect to Teamster drivers, our driver members are typically paid for all of their off-duty time. And then there's this whole idea of paid for detention time, right, which I think is probably a little easier to enforce should there be a contract between the shipper and a motor carrier than it would be for an independent driver. So we think it's important to properly classify the drivers on the one hand. We think that the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration is doing rulemaking on coercion that we think might lend itself to helping to resolve this, because it brings, as I understand this proposed rule, it brings shippers into the enforcement jurisdiction of the agency. And this might be a way to bring them in and give independent drivers some leverage in dealing with the issue.
You know, in terms of the detention time or wait time, again, many of these drivers are only paid sometimes by the load when they pick it up or drop it off, and yet there is so much wait time. I particularly felt badly for them recently at what was going on at the ports, because of the shippers who gave up the chassis, the ownerships of the chassis, to a third party, which meant the chassis were not where they needed to be for these drivers to pick up the chassis and their load, which gave them more wait time and detention time. Could you, I just have a few seconds left, but could you elaborate on your comment earlier that sometimes these drivers are then pressured to drive more hours?
Yeah, when you have a situation, and we've talked with the port drivers also, when you have a situation where you've had these extended wait periods and you are paid by the load and the shipper expects the product to be moved, they are oftentimes pressured to carry that load without regard to where they stand with respect to compliance with hours of service. That's a real problem. Again, we think that the coercion rulemaking might help us on that.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Well, I think driving a truck is a good career. It ought to be a good career and ought to be something where someone could earn a good living by driving a truck, moving this country's goods. So thank you. I yield back.